Take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me.
The candles flickered low, casting long, shaky shadows against the stone walls as 13 men sit in heavy silence. You might think this is just a normal dinner, but look closer at their faces. One of them is holding a bag of silver with trembling hands, and another knows that before the sun rises, he will be betrayed by his very best friend. The air is thick with a secret so big it's about to change the entire world forever. Stay right here, because what happens at this table is not what you expect. The bread felt heavy in Jesus' hands as he broke it, the sound of the crust snapping like a thunderclap in the quiet room. He looked around at his friends, the men he had walked with, laughed with, and trusted. But tonight, the air felt different. It was thick and cold, even with the glowing lamps nearby. "One of you will betray me," he said softly. The words hit the table harder than any stone. Peter gasped, leaning forward with wide, searching eyes, while others started whispering in a panic, pointing at themselves in disbelief. But in the corner of the room, tucked away in the deepest shadow, Judas felt the weight of the 30 silver coins hidden in his robe. They felt like ice against his skin. Every time the coins clinked, it sounded like a heartbeat counting down the seconds. He didn't look up. He couldn't. As Jesus passed the cup of wine, their eyes met for just a split second. In that look, there was no anger, only a sadness so deep it could drown the world. The trap was set, the price was paid, and the sun would never rise on these 13 friends ever again. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and a gust of cold night air rushed into the warm room, snuffed out a single candle. Without a word, Judas stepped into the blackness. The sound of his sandals hitting the stone floor faded into the distance, leaving the remaining 12 in a silence that felt like a physical weight. Every breath felt stolen. Every shadow on the wall seemed to stretch out like reaching fingers. Jesus led them out toward the Garden of Gethsemane, his footsteps slow and purposeful. The silver olive trees shivered in the breeze, their twisted trunks looking like ghosts in the moonlight. While the others struggled to keep their eyes open, Jesus fell to his knees. The ground was hard and cold, but the battle inside him was hotter than any fire. He wasn't just praying, he was fighting a war no one else could see. Suddenly, the peaceful silence of the woods was shattered. The faint clinking of metal armor and the orange glow of torches began to dance through the trees. The friend who had just shared their bread was returning, but he wasn't alone. The darkness was closing in. The orange glow of the torches grew brighter, casting jagged, dancing shadows across the gnarled trees. The heavy thud of boots on the damp earth sounded like a drumbeat of doom. Peter scrambled to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for his sword, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. But Jesus stood perfectly still, his face pale yet calm under the cold moonlight. He knew the end had finally arrived. Out of the wall of armored soldiers stepped a familiar face. Judas moved forward, his eyes darting away from the others as if the silver in his pocket was burning through his skin. With a trembling hand, he reached out and gave Jesus a kiss, the ultimate sign of friendship used as a weapon of betrayal. "Friend," he whispered, and the word hung in the air like a heavy mist. Suddenly, the garden erupted into chaos. Steel clashed against steel, and shouts filled the night air. The disciples scattered into the darkness, leaving their teacher behind. As the heavy iron chains were locked around Jesus' wrists, the flickering torches began to move away, fading into the distance. The Last Supper was over, and the long, dark walk to the end had just begun. The sky turned a bruised purple as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, but there was no warmth in the sun. Jesus was led through the iron gates of the city, his bare feet dragging against the sharp, dusty stones. The quiet intimacy of the upper room felt like a lifetime ago. Now the air was filled with the harsh clanging of Roman armor and the angry shouts of a growing crowd. High on his stone throne, the governor looked down with cold, tired eyes. He saw a man beaten and bound, yet Jesus stood with a quiet dignity that made the powerful ruler shiver. Outside, the people who had cheered for him just days ago were now pointing fingers and calling for the end. Peter watched from the shadows of a nearby fire, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. When someone asked if he knew the prisoner, he turned away, his voice breaking as he lied to save himself. The cock crowed, piercing the morning air. The betrayal was complete. The meal was finished, the garden was empty, and now the path led only to the hill. The sky grew heavy and dark, as if the sun itself couldn't bear to watch what was happening on the hill. A bitter wind swept through the valley, carrying the scent of dust and the sound of hammers striking iron. On top of the jagged rocks, Jesus took his final shallow breaths. The 13 friends who had shared bread and wine just hours ago were now scattered like fallen leaves in a storm. In a field far away, a bag of 30 silver coins lay forgotten in the dirt, their shine dulled by the shadows of regret. The betrayal was finished, but as the earth began to tremble and the heavy curtain in the temple tore right down the middle, something shifted in the air. The silence that followed wasn't the end of a tragedy, it was the start of something much bigger. The table in the upper room was empty now, the crumbs of the bread and the stains of the wine left behind as symbols of a promise. The shadows had done their worst, but as the first stars began to peek through the dark clouds, a tiny spark of hope remained. The Last Supper was over, but the story was just beginning.
3 days had passed, and the silence in the city felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The disciples huddled together in a locked room, their voices hushed and their hearts shattered. They looked at the empty chairs where they had sat just nights before, the memory of the bread and the wine now tasting like ash. Every creak of the floorboards made them jump, fearing the soldiers were coming for them next. The betrayal felt final, and the hope they once carried seemed buried deep in a cold stone tomb. But as the Sunday sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold and pink, the heavy air suddenly shifted. A frantic knocking at the door startled them all. Mary stood there, breathless and wide-eyed, her voice trembling with a joy that defied the darkness. "The stone is gone!" she cried out. The tomb was empty. The silver coins were forgotten, the shadows of the garden had vanished, and the bread broken at that last meal suddenly meant everything. The story didn't end in the dark, it was just waking up. The heavy wooden door burst open, but it wasn't the clanging of Roman armor that filled the room. Instead, a light so bright it seemed to swallow the shadows poured inside. The disciples shielded their eyes, their hearts hammering against their ribs. In the center of the glow stood a figure they knew better than their own breath. It was Jesus. He wasn't a ghost or a memory. He was standing there, the marks of the struggle still on his hands, but his face shining with a peace that surpassed the storm. "Peace be with you," he whispered, and the fear that had gripped them for days simply melted away like morning mist. They gathered around him, touching the hem of his robe, realizing that the bread broken at the Last Supper was a promise that could never be destroyed. The betrayal was over, the death was defeated. As they looked at each other, the 13 seats at the table didn't feel empty anymore. They felt like the foundation of a new world. The dark night had finally ended, and the sun was never going to set on this story again. The mountain air was cool and crisp as the disciples stood on the high ridge, looking out over the world they were about to change. The flickering candles of the upper room were gone, replaced by the brilliant, golden light of a new beginning. Jesus stood among them one last time, his voice steady and full of a power that made the very ground feel alive. He wasn't just their teacher anymore. He was the king who had walked through the dark and come out stronger on the other side. "Go," he told them, his eyes meeting theirs with a fire that would never go out. "Tell the story to everyone, everywhere." As he began to rise, disappearing into the soft white clouds, the disciples didn't feel lonely or afraid. They remembered the broken bread and the shared cup. They understood now that the Last Supper wasn't a goodbye, it was an invitation. They turned back toward the city, their hearts full and their footsteps light. The shadows of betrayal were buried in the past, and a bright, endless future was waiting for them to claim it. The streets of Jerusalem felt different as the disciples walked back, their faces glowing with a secret the world wasn't ready for yet. The heavy chains, the flickering torches, and the silver coins were all gone, replaced by a courage that burned brighter than any sun. They returned to that same upper room one last time, looking at the table where it all began. The dust had settled on the wooden surface, but the echoes of Jesus' voice still seemed to hum in the very walls. They realized then that the Last Supper wasn't just a meal, it was a heartbeat that would never stop. Every time they broke bread from that day on, they weren't just eating, they were remembering a love that was stronger than death and a friendship that could cross the stars. They stepped back out into the light, ready to face kings and storms alike. The story that started in a dark room with 13 men was now spreading like wildfire across the earth. The supper was over, but the feast of hope had only just begun. The world beyond the upper room was vast and untamed, but the disciples no longer walked with trembling steps. The memory of that final meal had become their greatest strength, a shield against the storms they knew were coming. As they reached the city gates and looked out toward the distant horizons, they realized that the shadows of betrayal had been swallowed by an eternal light. The silver coins that once rattled with greed were now silent, buried under the weight of a love that had redesigned history. They looked back one last time at the hill where the darkness had tried to win, and they smiled. The table was empty, the cup was drained, and the bread was gone. But the spirit of that night lived on in every word they spoke. From that small stone room to the ends of the earth, the story of the Last Supper would be told in 1,000 languages to millions of hearts. The flickering candles were out, but a new sun had risen, and for the first time, the world was truly awake.